Hi there, I'm Jenn Jarnagin, and I'm going to be talking with you about equity in assessment, grading and feedback in the inclusive Latin classroom. And I am a Latin teacher in Dallas, Texas. So let's get started. So a quick note on equity and assessment, or excuse me, on equity versus equality, more broadly speaking. I really like this visual on sort of the difference between what equal is versus what equity is versus removing systemic barriers. So we've got this systemic barrier here in the first two pictures. In the first one, they're all being treated equally. They've all been given the same support, but notice one person didn't need it. It's helping the other person, and it's still not doing very much for this third person. But in this one where there's equity, right, the first person doesn't need anything to be able to see the game, right? But they need one support, right? This particular student needs two supports to see what's going on, right? A lot of times where we are in our classroom, this is definitely something we can control, right? We can sort of help shift from a mindset of giving all students exactly the same thing to giving every student what they need to be successful. But ideally, we can push for systemic changes, right? Things that will allow us to not have to give those supports at all, and everyone can just show up exactly as they are and find success, right? Or in this metaphor, enjoy the game, as it were. So I challenge you to think about these things, think about any systemic barriers that you might be able to help address at your school, in your community. You may find that there are ways you can sort of influence this, but you can definitely shift to where in your classroom you're giving all students what they need to find success. So one of the things that you really need to ask yourself fundamentally before assessing anything is, what is it that students really need to be able to do, right? In my experience, what students need to be able to do is read some Latin and make inferences, right? They need to be able to pull out details. They need to be able to understand any subtleties as they go on, right? So a novice reader is not going to be able to understand subtlety in a second language, right? But as they grow and develop their language skills, are they able to pick up on when a character is being sarcastic? Can they understand when when the Latin is insinuating something, right? Can they make those sorts of inferences? Do they understand how different pieces of information are fitting together, right? We also want students to be able to develop intercultural competence. Look at how a text relates to Roman culture, right? Look at how our culture that we are in compares with that of the Romans. What are some ways we're similar? What are some ways we're different? What is it that we owe to the Romans in terms of our own culture? All those sorts of things, right? But in my experience with traditional textbooks and methodologies, both as a student and as a teacher, I tend to expect students to memorize paradigms, to synopsize verbs, memorize vocab lists, decode sentences, which is not really the same as reading. But when you really ask yourself, what is it that students need to be able to do? If you're focusing on the first set of them, reading, developing competence, you're looking at things that empower students, right? It's very empowering for a student to be able to read a text and understand the subtleties and understand what's going on. It's very empowering for a student to be able to speak intelligently and critically about culture. It helps them understand and recognize things in their own culture. It helps them understand better political discourse, civic discourse. It just is a really empowering part of their education. But a lot of those traditional textbook things and sort of traditional tests are really about gatekeeping, right? It's about weeding out the students who can't memorize, the students who can't decode, the students who can't rattle off, well, this is an ablative of place from which, and this is an ablative of cause, and this is a dative of degree of difference, and yada, yada, yada. And I love all those things. I love Latin grammar, but you don't have to understand all of those little finicky grammar bits to read and make inferences. You don't need to understand all of those little bits or memorize every vowel change in the third conjugation, verb chart to develop intercultural competence. And really those behaviors are entrenched in gatekeeping and sort of keeping the ivory tower mentality in place, which I think we all want to question and resist and go beyond. There's a great further reading article on this, or further reading on this. It's an article, Read Like a Roman, that Catherine Russell wrote, and it's available in the Journal of Classical Teaching. And Catherine goes into this idea of how do we teach children to read versus decoding. So I highly recommend that. So similarly, you really need to ask yourself, what are you actually assessing? Right? So if a student reads a Latin passage and you ask them a bunch of questions about that reading that are also in Latin, and a kid gets one wrong, are they getting it wrong because they didn't understand the story? Or are they getting it wrong because they didn't understand the question? So you have to be careful, right, about not falling into that trap. If I use Latin questions, I use very highly rehearsed ones that I know students will know. I tend to ask, quid agit, what's he doing or what is she doing? Quid agunt, what are they doing? I tend to ask cur, right, why, or quis, quid, those sorts of things. I also have question posters in my room, and those stay up during tests because I don't really care if a kid wants to glance at the question on the wall to make sure they understand the question that I'm asking them. I'm much more interested in, can they understand how to answer it? Or can they understand, what I'm asking them about? If a student is asked to synopsize a verb and they use the wrong vowel, does that mean they really don't understand how various verb forms function in context? Does it mean they don't understand how to read stories with verbs in them? Or does it mean that they're just not a strong memorizer, right? Does it mean that perhaps they have an accent that makes spelling Latin phonetically difficult? I know that I tend to tell students that Latin is spelled how it sounds, but if students aren't pronouncing it quite the way that I am, what in my mind is very easy to spell like it sounds, it may not be so easy for them. There's that horrible joie sound, that right? Sometimes it's an I, sometimes it's a U. Unless a student is really sort of exaggerating it when they're saying it to themselves, they could very well end up misspelling a word. And that doesn't mean that they don't understand its tense or understand the number, or understand the person, or any of those sorts of things. So if you want students to demonstrate their understanding, it's really important that you can remove all the barriers to that demonstration. So some of the barriers that I have found really come in some pretty sneaky places. So sometimes my directions just aren't clear enough. And if a student doesn't understand exactly what you want them to do, they're probably not going to be able to do it that well. So making sure that your directions are really clear, not just to you, but to them as well. Make sure that you're using consistent formatting with enough blank space that kids aren't hit with this sort of wall of text that it can feel very overwhelming for students, even if it's a story they've read before, even if it's vocabulary that you think is really manageable for them. Breaking it into smaller chunks at a time, or just thinking about how you format it on the page, really does help it feel less overwhelming for students. And that's going to help them do better, because that can in fact be a barrier if it triggers anxiety for them. I know so many students that I encounter feel so much anxiety around tests that that's one way you can sort of help combat that for them. Another way is to make sure that you're using fonts and colors that all of your students can read with ease. And lastly, choice. Right? Choice is one of the single most powerful things we can leverage in our assessments to help students out. So it helps build confidence for students. The amount of confidence that they're going to have in their ability to accomplish the task is going to impact their performance. Right? The more worried a kid is, the more they're going to second guess themselves, the more they're going to talk themselves out of the right answer. They're going to get in their head. They're they're going to start making mistakes. Choice also eliminates stress and empowers them to critically evaluate their own ability levels and decide which task or tasks is going to provide the best showcase of their work, right? And then you as a teacher, you're going to get the same feedback on what they've learned, but giving them some choice is going to build trust and confidence and develop a sense of autonomy for students. That sense of autonomy is so important. Research shows that it really helps students develop a sense of intrinsic motivation, and that internal motivation leads to positive learning outcomes over the course of years and years. It's going from, well, I need to memorize this so that I get an A on the test, to I want to do better, right? I want to know what I did wrong so I can get better at it. It goes from, I need to do well so that my parents don't ground me for doing badly, to I feel really good about this. I'm excited to show how well I do. So that intrinsic idea, that intrinsic motivation really will help kind of propel students forward across their academic career. And it's also important to point out that when you give students choice, that doesn't mean you have to create 5 entirely different assessments or anything like that. It can be as simple as, if you give students 10 questions, let them pick 7 to answer, right? That's still going to give you, make sure that they're all going to give you the information that you need, but that way kids have some say. They can choose which questions they feel most confident that they can answer well, or give them, 15 sentences and they choose 10 to translate, or whatever the case may be. That amount of choice really does make a difference. And if you're in a situation where you need to assess their ability to decline a noun or conjugate a verb, giving them a list to choose from, right? Things like that really can help them feel more confident. And if you're interested in some more reading on this, Learning to Choose, Choosing to Learn by Mike Anderson is a great resource. Here's a little bit on my approach to assessment. Ideally, I give quizzes and tests when I'm confident that 80% of students will get an 80 or better. But of course, how often are things ideal? But when that happens, what I do is adapt, right? If there are external restraints on this, I have to adapt. When that happens, I give study guides that match the format of tests. That way students know exactly what my instructions are going to look like. They know how long it's going to be. They know what the sections are. They understand what skills they're going to need to demonstrate to me. They're going to know how, what I'm looking for and how I'm going to ask them. And then I use a judicious, I use pop quizzes judiciously. I refer to them as snapshots of learning. And I try to frame it as, this is not a gotcha. This is not a zinger. I'm not interested in tricking you. It lets me know if I'm doing my job. My job is to teach you so that you learn. This just lets me see if I'm doing a good job so far. And then I say, and don't you want me to know if I'm doing a good job? Like, wouldn't you rather I find out with this little pop quiz today as opposed to on your test in 2 weeks? Wouldn't you rather me know now if I need to make some adjustments in how I'm teaching so that you do well? And they're all like, oh yeah. So kind of explaining that to them helps them buy in a little bit. It helps take some of that anxiety down over time. And sometimes when I start giving those quizzes, I'll start with things that I know are very, everyone in the room will be successful on, right? I know that I'm not asking anything that's too demanding or anything that only some of the students have demonstrated an ability to do. And the reason I do that is it just builds that confidence. It helps kids not be afraid of a quiz. It helps them feel more confident. And once they have that confidence, you can give them more difficult quizzes. You can ask them to do more and more difficult things, and they're not going to be worried about it. They're going to feel like, oh, I've got this, right? I also always explain the why behind my assessments for students, right? So if I want them to do a specific thing a certain way, I make sure they understand why I want it done that way. An example of this might be if I know that I have students who are interested in taking AP Latin, I'm going to make sure that I word things in the way the AP Latin exam does so they get used to that wording. If I'm going to grade by chunks like chunking the way they do on AP. I let students know that so they understand why that's happening. And I invite students to be a part of this process. It's really great if you can tell kids, hey, I need for you to be able to show me that you understand the difference between imperfect and perfect. What are some ways we could do that? Or, hey, what are some ways that you could show me that you understand the difference between ablatives and accusatives, or prepositions that use the ablative, prepositions that use the accusative? What are some things you could do? You'll get some really interesting suggestions, and sometimes some pretty cool projects and things have grown out of that. So it's a really fun thing. I invite you to ask kids that question. And then Keith Toda and Martina Becks both have blogs that have lots and lots and lots of examples of assessments. Keith Toda's are going to be Latin related because he's a Latin teacher. Martina Becks is a Spanish teacher, so they're not going to be directly applicable to Latin, but they are still going to give you some really good ideas. The other thing is we really want to focus on shifting our thinking from, well, it's important because it's on the test, to it's on the test because it's important. I know that when I first started teaching, I fell into this trap of teaching kids things just because they were always on tests that I took as a student. But a lot of the tests that I took as a student came from this gatekeeping mentality. And once I realized that, a lot of those things I could drop, I don't really need a student to be able to fill out a noun chart. That really is just testing their ability to memorize a chart. What I want students to do is to be able to understand when they're reading the difference between something that's dative and something that's genitive and something that's ablative. It's much more important that they can use those things in context and understand them in context than regurgitate a chart. So if you think that writing a noun chart is important because that noun chart is on your test, you kind of think about that a little bit more. Is it really important enough that it deserves to be on the test? So make sure that what you put on your test is there because it is important that students can do. It's also important to think about what is it that you're really assessing or what you're really grading students for. Are you evaluating their ability to understand something? Are you evaluating their proficiency or their mastery? Or are you really just looking for compliance? So are you looking at their ability to follow directions, to memorize, to demonstrate their understanding on a topic, to read and infer? There's all sorts of different things you could actually be evaluating students for. So you want to make sure that your assessments reflect what you want to evaluate and then weight it appropriately. So for example, what skills are the most important for mastery of a concept? And then make sure that those skills are weighted the most because they're the most important, right? What types of tasks adequately prove students have mastered those skills? You want to make sure that what you're asking a kid to do really does demonstrate their mastery of that skill, right? Not just they can memorize and regurgitate, but they can show it to you. If you really want students to understand how to use imperfects, perhaps have them write something in the imperfect, recount something that happened yesterday. What did you do last weekend? Something like that. And similarly, perhaps don't evaluate their ability to write in the imperfect if what you want to assess is their ability to use the dative or something, right? So make sure that what you're trying to assess them on is matching what you're asking them to do and what you're asking them about, right? So something else to think about, turning work in on time is a good life skill. Firm deadlines train students in compliance, but is compliance really as important as mastery? If you are in a position to have any say over late grades, late policies, things like that, I suggest that you consider taking less off for it being late than you take off for a student mastering something. So, I within reason, of course. If something is several months late, maybe you don't give them credit at all. It's just thank you for finally doing this. I don't know. Every situation is different. But if a student turns something in a day late and it's because they accidentally forgot their homework at home, or they forgot to charge their computer and it was dead, so they couldn't submit it at school, or whatever the case may be, maybe you ding them a few points. But is it really worth taking off half of their points for? Isn't it more important that they can show that they've mastered something than that it's late? So, for example, I'm going to get in a lot more trouble as a teacher if I can't demonstrate my ability to teach, right? If I'm not a proficient teacher, that is a much bigger problem than if I'm running 15 minutes late one day. Kind of the same idea for the kids. I think we forget that sometimes. I would certainly not want my employer to judge me if I'm running late one day, if I accidentally oversleep, or there's a traffic jam and I'm stuck and I'm running late. Those are things that are going to happen sometimes. Sometimes a kid's going to leave something at home, or they might have moved from their mom's house to their dad's house and accidentally left their book at home, so they couldn't do the homework, or these things happen sometimes. If it's a pattern of behavior, that's a different thing. But if it happens once, is it really worth dinging, taking a whole half off their grade? It's something to think about. Assessing Proficiency in the Classroom by Eric Herman talks a little bit more about these skills that demonstrate mastery. Here are some examples of my assessments. I'm going to show you just one of each. So this is an example of a vocab quiz. This is stage 12 in Cambridge. So kids who get to stage 12, they're about in novice high, maybe intermediate low, right in there. So what I do for this stage of their learning is I'll give them a sentence, and then I put one of the words in bold, and they need to write out what that word means in the context of the sentence. So amicisti isn't to lose, it's you lost, or you have lost, right? Flamas isn't flame, it's flames. In this instance, Caecilius Jacebat was lying, or he was lying, right? That kind of thing. So I find this to be a really good indicator of whether or not a student can read the vocab words from this stage in context and understand them. I'm not really interested in whether or not a student can memorize the dictionary listing, because we don't actually use Latin words in isolation, because I'm not really interested in a kid's ability to recognize every single little word one at a time, but rather how those words work together in a sentence. I give them a sentence and I just put in bold the word that I want them to give me the meaning of. And that works pretty well for me. For my declension of nouns, this is for when students are just starting out. This is novice, low to mid students. I give them sentences. They tell me whether the word that's bold is nominative or accusative, and whether it's singular or plural. Then they choose 3 to translate. So I'm still evaluating their understanding of some grammar terms, but they're not having to memorize a paradigm. They're not having to spit out a noun chart. They're not having to decline a noun correctly, because I have a lot of students who struggle with spelling. I have a lot of students who have accommodations to make allowances for misspellings. And this just really helps put them on level footing with students who don't have those accommodations. And then I give them choice to choose which ones to translate. That way they get to pick which sentence they feel like they really understand the meaning of and can be successful on. So it's a good idea, or a good example of what I mean when I say give them choice. And notice, every kid can get the same quiz. I didn't have to reinvent the wheel and make 18 different things, but there is still some choice being represented here for students. I've also got some tests and some major projects. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'll just show you one test. You get a feel for what I do. So all of them start with reading and grammar comprehension. This one, there's a lot of reading on it. We get to find out what happens at the end of stage 12 of Cambridge, and it's, we find out what happened to Grumio, and it's just too good not to share. Kids always react very strongly to this story, so I kind of like giving it to them on a test because they're like, oh, like you can tell as they read that sentence, they all like look up at me. It's kind of fun. And notice I break it up across several pages so they don't see this like giant Latin story all at once. I've kind of broken it into smaller pieces. For culture, same idea with choice. I give them a word bank. They write a paragraph about the excavation of Pompeii, and they get to pick which terms to incorporate into it. And then for translation, I grade their translation on a rubric. And notice, to get full credit, it's not that they don't make any mistakes at all. It's that they're very minor, and there are only a few of them. This is a really empowering thing for students. It helps them realize that I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for good, solid work. Perfection is just not very realistic in any aspect of our lives. And so I don't really want to make students think that they need to be perfect in class. So here are some suggestions for starting points when you're looking at your own assessments. Right? Think of one assessment that you give that students always struggle with. Look at this one and think about whether there might be some barriers that exist. Are the directions, the phrasing, the formatting, are all of those consistent? Are they very understandable for students? Are you assessing what you think you're assessing? Or have you run into that issue where you think you're assessing one thing, but you're really looking at kids' ability to spell correctly? Kids' ability to memorize, that kind of thing. Are students given any choice in how they demonstrate their learning? See if there's anything you can kind of tweak or modify, work a little choice in there. Excuse me. Finally, think about how are you grading this assessment? What separates a 98 from a 97 in the grand scheme of things? Could a kid really give you an answer for why they got a 97 and not a 98? Unless you have a 100 point, like I missed 3 of them, so I got a 97 versus I missed 2, so I got a 98. What really separates them, right? Are you looking to give points to students, or are you looking to take points from them? I myself am a give points to kids kind of teacher, and I tell them that. So many kids, if something is hard, they just skip it, or their instinct is to just leave it blank. But I tell them, trust what you know. If you're not 100% sure what a word in a story means, but you have a reasonable guess that makes sense in the context of the story, assume you're right. Keep reading and answer the question. Put something down. Because even if it's not exactly right, it's probably close enough that I can give you some credit for it. Like, you may not remember what ambulat means, but if you know it's some form of motion, getting from point A to point B, maybe you write going, but it's walking. You're still on the right track. That's going to get you some credit. Whereas if you leave it blank, I can't give you anything. And then estimating in inches versus yards. This is a metaphor for grading that I found really helpful. If all of us were in a room and we were asked to estimate how long, one of the walls in the room was, if we estimated in inches, we would have wildly different answers. But if we estimated in yards, because yards are larger, we're going to be much closer to each other. And that's really how grading works as well. A 100-point scale is just too big to really be accurate from person to person to person. But a smaller scale, like let's say if you could grade on a 1 to 4, we'd probably all agree on what a 1 looks like versus a 2 versus a 3 versus a 4. So if you can switch to a more standards-based approach, if you can use more rubrics that are holistic, these are things that you're going to find really help with your grading. There's a phenomenal book that I cannot recommend highly enough called Grading for Equity: What It Is, Why It Matters, and How It Can Transform Schools and Classrooms by Joe Feldman. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It is wonderful. Here's a little bit on how I grade. Not like this, so not on a curve where you sort of compare kids to each other, but rather I use as many rubrics as possible. I base them on the ACTFL rubrics, but I do change the language. Actful tends to be a bit wordy. It tends to be written for adults who are themselves language teachers. It's not language that a fifth grader is going to understand, right? And then I use different rubrics for my fifth graders than I do for my eighth graders, than I do for my 11th and 12th graders. Because as they progress in their language, you can look for things that are more nuanced. You can look for more detail. You can expect kids to recognize more subtle differences, right? When kids are just starting out, I'm looking, do they understand the big picture? Then I start looking for, do they understand supporting details, right? Can they use context clues for words that they don't know and figure out what's going on? And then it becomes, things like in my Latin 4 honors class, can they detect sarcasm? Can they understand a joke? Can they understand the allusions that are being made? Right, so things that are more sophisticated. Can they pick up on metaphors, things like that? When I do numerical grading, I give partial credit whenever possible. Like I said, I'm always looking to give points to kids rather than take points away from them. So here's where things get a little controversial when it comes to retake policies. In my experience, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are the people who see these as opportunities for growth and things that build confidence in students. They build trust between students and teachers. And then the people who think, well, why didn't they just work hard the first time? I'm rewarding bad behavior if I let them do a retake, yada, yada, yada. You can probably tell from the way I said that I'm in the rainbow SpongeBob camp. But here's why I feel that way and how exactly I implement it. I let students retake quizzes without a minimum score. They didn't have to fail or have to get below an 85 or anything like that. And I don't average the two scores together. I don't let them retake, but they can only get up to an 85 or whatever else. Any student who thinks, for whatever reason, that wasn't their best work on a quiz can retake the quiz. It's really that simple. Now, I do tell students, because you always have the kid who asks, like, well, even if I get a 99, can I retake the quiz? And I tell them, if you really have nothing else going on in your life that you would rather do than meet with me and discuss why you got the 99 and tell me your strategy and then study again and come back and get that 100, if you have nothing else going on in your life, maybe, but wouldn't you rather just go watch something on Netflix? Like, wouldn't you rather hang out with your friends? Like, don't you have a life to live? Come on. And then they kind of jokingly, yeah, I understand. So that's kind of how I handle when kids get a little sassy about it. I find this to be a really good policy that works really well for me. What students have to do before they take a retake, they have to meet with me to debrief. They need to tell me what they got wrong, why they got that wrong, what their plan is, like what are they, how are they going to make adjustments, right? And that's really important because there's a very big difference between a student who says, oh, miss, I just forgot to study. I realized, I totally forgot we had a quiz. I tried my best, got a 73, but I know I can do better. Like, okay, great. You're going to study, fine. Versus a kid who says, I studied for 3 hours and I made a 54. Like, that kid needs some help. Clearly, they're either they didn't study the right thing or they didn't understand what I was looking for, or like that requires a conversation. So they have to talk with me first so I can figure out exactly what's going on. And then they have a set period of time to complete that retake. What my window is from when they took the first quiz to when there's a test. Over that, it's usually about a week in between the two, maybe 2 weeks in between the two. That's their retake window. After that, they don't get to go back unless it's a pretty extraordinary circumstance, of course. Then I don't typically let students retake tests unless there's a pretty extreme circumstance. I handle this on a case-by-case basis. What I'm more likely to do if a student really does poorly on a test is let them make corrections. The way that I handle corrections is they have to note what they missed and why they got it wrong, or why the right answer was right. So it's not just, looking off a friend and copying. They really have to take that extra step and tell me why what they did was wrong or why the right answer is right. And again, you're helping build that reflection idea. You're helping kids understand that after they've taken a test or a quiz, they need to look at the feedback you give them and actually use it and make a plan and get better. I'm trying to train students in how to do all of those things. So I find that a retake policy is pretty high motivation to teach them those things. And it helps them. And even I've never had more than maybe 4 students in a class need a retake. A lot of students never use this policy, but knowing that it's there really helps them feel more confident and more comfortable, and it really helps build some trust. And again, just like with retakes, if students are doing corrections, they have a set amount of time in which they can complete this task. Firm deadlines for things like retakes are essential. Otherwise, it can just drag on forever, and nobody has time for that. You may be asking yourself, yeah, but what if kids abuse it? I have a conversation with them. That's the first thing. And I tell them, it's starting to feel like you're abusing this policy. It's pretty convenient that, you never remember to study for the quizzes and you've always got to retake them. That really is starting to feel like you're maybe choosing not to study. And that's really not what this is for. This isn't, hey, you don't have to study if you don't want to, do it when you feel like it. This is a policy for people who made a mistake and want to do better. And I'd hate to take that opportunity away from you moving forward. But if it feels like you're not using this the way it was intended, we're moving forward. We're gonna see what happens. But if I notice this pattern continue, I'm not gonna be able to let you take any more retakes. That's as much as I've ever had to say. I've never had to go beyond that conversation with a kid, because they do realize that this is a good policy. They realize that if they've had horrible friend drama, epic blow up, meltdown friend drama, boyfriend drama, girlfriend drama, whatever drama, they're not in a headspace to do well. And Lord knows middle schoolers are very dramatic. So it is helpful for them. They know that they might be in a position where they have left something at home and forgot to study, or left something in school and forgot to study. Sometimes you get busy and you're just going to forget something, right? They might be really involved in sports or in dance or in theater and forget to study. Knowing that they can do this helps build that trust, and it really helps them perform better in the long run, I find. I like this because it fosters a growth mindset for students. There's also less motivation to cheat. I tell students, I understand that sometimes you're really worried you might not get a good grade, especially if you totally forgot to study or if you don't feel particularly confident. I understand how tempting it can be to look off of a neighbor. I remember being a kid. I understand. But if you make that choice, it's got to be a 0. It's got to be an honor code violation. We've got to let the principal know. We've got to let your parents know. It becomes this whole thing, unfortunately. Or you can just try your best, right? Answer what you know. Take educated guesses as much as you can. I'll grade it. You'll get feedback. And you can retake it if you need to. Sometimes kids surprise themselves and they do really well and they don't want to do a retake. Other times they might legitimately need that retake. But you're kind of helping walk them through the consequences of that split decision. That's a bad choice to cheat. We know students are impulsive. We know students are really scared of upsetting parents or getting grounded or things like that. They're really worried about those things. And so reminding them of this retake kind of helps them not make that choice. But if a student unfortunately does decide to cheat, it's pretty easy to catch, especially what I tend to see if students have tried to cheat. Typically what it is they come in for a retake, but what they did was they just memorized the old quiz, but I don't give the same exact quiz. For example, on vocab quizzes, I might change the tense of the verb or the number of the verb or the number of the noun, or it might go from being a sentence where the noun is nominative singular to accusative plural or something like that, right? So students memorizing one version, they're not going to do well in the retake. And that becomes another conversation that we have that they're not really going to enjoy, but will help them grow and make better choices in the future. Some more reading on this idea of the growth mindset is the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. We read that as a professional development book one time, and it was well written. I recommend it. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have enjoyed my talk here. I hope it's giving you some ideas for your assessments. Feel free to reach out to me. My blog is magistraj.blogspot.com, and I've posted more resources there, both in addition to this talk, some other resources on some of the other materials I'm producing with Cambridge, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. So thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye.